Today's January 9, 2021, and we're really proud that Mark Jones will be speaking about the role of planetary nodes through collective evolution. It's great that Mark could join us this way. I contacted him back a year or two and saying that I hoped he would consider speaking for us if he was ever in the area. And that was the hope. Sometimes we do have speakers from other parts of the world, and because they were doing a big conference, they'd get to come by and speak to us in Tucson. But now we're really grateful that we can have this Zoom, this digital format, and now the whole world is in our area. Mark has just come out with a new book from which he draws material for today's lecture. He's written other books and lectures widely. I hope you will check out his website at plutoschool.com. And without further ado, let's put our hands together and welcome Mark Jones.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. And just while I set up my screen share here, if I can just say, you know, there's a kind of level, I guess, with any presentation. Astrology is an enormously complex subject. We could say that, you know, there's not everything we're going to understand, but this is really the case here. So if you don't understand some of this presentation, don't worry, because in a sense, no one does. You know, this is an investigative process. I'm sharing with you the culmination of about 15, maybe longer years of research, and in particular, a very intense period of research for the last 3 or 4 years. And that's from this book. So it started, you know, private research when I discovered the planetary nodes. Then it reached a kind of fulcrum when I encountered the work of the late thought of Dane Rudhyar, but his late thought in particularly a 1971 pamphlet for the Theosophical Society called The Lunar and Planetary Nodes. And this kick-started a revolution in my thinking about both the planetary and lunar nodes. It was initially a colleague of mine in a rural cottage in Wales. We went for a week with we're both therapists, client charts and historical charts, mainly sourced from Campion's Book of World Horoscopes. And we went for the week to, in his phrase, discover if the planetary nodes had escape velocity as an idea, if it had enough traction to escape the orbit of planet Earth, as it were, in terms of its power or meaning. And it was the end of day one, we realized we were just onto a gold. We were mining a gold stream effectively, and I'm going to try and share some of that. And then the last 3-4 years, I've been working, you know, I have a researcher work with me effectively full time. An independent astrologer works for me as a researcher. And together we've compiled this material, which I share a small amount with you today. But I'm not just saying it, right? You're not going to understand some of this. I don't understand some of this. This isn't a flaw. There's nothing wrong with you. It doesn't mean you're not clever or that you don't have a great astrological understanding otherwise. It shocked me. There was the work of Carl Payne-Toby, there was the work of Zip Dobbins, and there was Rudhyar in the early 70s in his late thought, which I've drawn from primarily. And then this kind of investigation seemed to stop, especially, as we'll go on to see in this presentation, the geocentric planetary nodes. And I'll explain why I focus my research primarily on those. But let's start simple. What are we talking about? What are planetary nodes? So just like the moon has nodes, which almost every astrologer understands, whether they focus on them primarily or not, every planet, apart from the luminary, the sun, every planet forms a nodal axis when it crosses the ecliptic. That's what we're looking at today. We're looking at, in particular, the planetary nodes of Jupiter outwards. And those nodes are formed, they're abstract points in space. There's nothing there. There's no rock with a sign on it saying south node of Jupiter or south node of the moon. They are abstract points in space formed when a planetary motion intersects the ecliptic. When it intersects it on a descending plane, it forms the south node. When it intersects it on an ascending plane, it forms its north node. Now, this is one of Rudyard's critical points. The two nodes are formed together. They cannot be separated. This has implications for the lunar nodes. You frequently see in books on the lunar nodes that they've been separated. South node in the second, south node in Libra is analyzed as a separate function. Yes.
Mark, I'm sorry to disturb you, but we're having reports of people not being able to hear you. I think could you speak a little louder or turn up your mic or something? Put your mic closer.
How about this? I just turned the gain right up on the mic. Is that any different?
That's much, much better. Thank you.
So this crucial point is that the nodes are formed together and that they cannot be separated analytically. If we have time today, and it's questionable, I have a whole section on the impact of our understanding of the lunar nodes from this point. But let's just frame this from the beginning. When we look at the nodal axis of a planet or the moon, we cannot separate them. You cannot just say, south node is this separate thing and analyze it. They are formed together. Now, why is this so important to Rudyard? Because he sees individual planetary positions effectively in his late thought as single points in space. You have the planet Saturn at 7 Aquarius. Boom, it's here. Whereas the nodal axis, as forming 2 points of a parabola of motion, indicates the entire orb, the entire orbital range of that planetary archetype. So Rudyard is implying in his late work that the nodes of the planets and the nodes of the moon are more important than the planets themselves. That's how radical Rudyard becomes. He talks about the planetary nodes as early as the Astrology of Personality in 1936, but by 1971, in this small pamphlet for the Theosophical Society, he has decided that the entire orbit of a planet is a cosmic fact which transcends sense perception. So he's saying the nodes of planets show you their entire orbital motion and are therefore more significant than the single fixed point of a planetary object. I mean, mind-blowing in a way, when we already face the complexity of analyzing the fixed points in a chart. He effectively calls this late vision of astrology orbital astrology. And he's saying that the chart is a dance. The chart is like a still photo of a moving dance. So your natal chart is like you're captured in one position, pulling a shape, but actually there is an entire motion of the dance going on. The nodes point to the real movement of that dance. Furthermore, the reason you can't separate the analysis of the nodes is that when you take the 2 points together, they are enough to form the parabola of motion. You cannot detect a parabola of motion from a single point. You require two to frame, two and time to frame the entire motion of an orbit. So rather like a cannonball, and engineers in war analyzing the arc of field artillery, the nodes describe an entire motion of a body. So when Rudyard urges us to look at the planetary nodes, he is saying Jupiter, Saturn, they evolve themselves. They themselves are going through a journey, just like we see the moon's nodes as a symbol of the moon's journey orbitally. He's saying that's also the case with Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Pluto, Neptune. That's why he feels they're so significant. There is then a second reason why Rudyard feels they're so significant. So we have the parabola of motion, but the parabola of motion is not formed like field artillery is because it's intersecting the plane of the Earth. The nodes are intersecting the plane of the ecliptic. And for Rudyard, the ecliptic, on which we find the zodiacal constellations, the ecliptic is the symbolic relationship of the Earth to the sun. because the ecliptic describes the apparent motion of the Earth around the sun. Rudyard sees the Earth-Sun relationship symbolically as rather like the personality and the higher self, or the planetary logos and the solar logos, if we were to delve into his theosophical thinking. So he sees the ecliptic itself as symbolic as the evolution of the Earth with regard to the higher power of the sun. So the nodes are formed. So the parabola of motion is described because there's two of them, but the parabola of the motion is also described because it intersects the ecliptic. So the nodes of the planets are describing the relationship, say, of Saturn, if it was Saturn's nodes, to the relationship of the Earth to the sun. So the fact that there's two of them describes the arc of motion. The fact that the two of them is formed by intersecting the ecliptic gives further information for that planetary body to the evolving Earth-Sun relationship, which he sees symbolically as the relationship between the personality and the soul, the ultimate psycho-spiritual orientation of human life. These are the two reasons why Rudyard thought in his late thought that lunar and planetary nodes were so significant. The sun, and this is all from Rudyard in this pamphlet, is the integrator of the whole system. The nodes are formed because they intersect at 2 points the relationship of the Earth to the integrator of the whole solar system and the representation of its ultimate and total significance. So planetary nodes are both describing the evolutionary arc of the planet and the potential archetypal meaning of that planetary archetype into the evolving life of the Earth on its journey around the sun. So let's just soak in for a second, again, how significant he feels this is. I repeat, what is at stake is the fundamental relationship of a planet and of our Earth as two related members of the solar system. In terms of individual birth charts, it is the manner in which the essential quality of a planet affects the very structure and the roots of our individuality as a member of the human species. So he believes that the nodes of the moon and the planets are cutting into the very core of our individuation as geocentric, as beings on planet Earth, as it journeys symbolically in the path of the ecliptic. So planetary archetypes themselves are evolving. Jupiter's evolving through its nodal axis. Pluto is evolving. Neptune is evolving. And they reveal something about the leading edge of that evolution when they intersect the ecliptic. And in their changing relationship to the intersection of that ecliptic, they reveal the main line of stress in the development of themselves as an archetype. We are looking effectively at how planetary archetypes themselves evolve. Let me show you in some graphic forms the nodes. We have the sun at the center of the solar system. We have the plane of the ecliptic created by the Earth's motion. We have a planet intersecting the ecliptic. So we have the Earth, its apparent motion around the sun, forming the circle of the constellations, and then we have a planet intersecting. And when that planet intersects that orbit, it forms its nodal axis. When it's descending, the south node; when it's ascending, the north node. It introduces the idea of celestial latitude to celestial longitude. That's explained in more detail in the book. So when we look down, this is a side view. If you now imagine coming and looking from above the planet, you see the point of intersection. So the nodes are describing the cosmic dance. It's as if a fantastic geometrician came into the center of a dance hall or a Sufi whirling dervish group and centered all the spinning. It shows how in the path of the dancers, they intersect at certain crucial points. And it makes us aware that the planets themselves are evolving in the cosmic dance, just like we are as the Earth travels around the ecliptic. Now, from this sort of technical understanding, we can say that there are two forms of looking at the nodes. There's the heliocentric and geocentric. Now, there's a lot of people are going to be frustrated with me because I chose to develop geocentric understanding so much. Now, I can make one simple observation. We live on planet Earth. That's one reason I chose geocentric. I'm going to explain a series of technical extra levels or layers of information that geocentric nodes give us. But let's just mourn the loss for a second, because heliocentric nodes are much more simple because they don't change very much. And we have to be aware here, and this is a current climate where everyone's coming up with new astrological things. You know, I am very loath to introduce to you new complex subjects to study. When I wrote my first book, Healing the Soul, Pluto, Uranus, and the Lunar Nodes in 2011, there was going to be a final chapter on the planetary nodes. And my editors just said, this is too much. But I was thinking about them as early as that. But one of my great concerns before I introduced them was not wanting to add additional material to the chart. There's already so many complex points, the asteroids, the Arabic parts, new asteroids, new dwarf planets. Everyone's got an idea. You know, we're barely coming to terms to understanding Chiron after all these years, since 77. The idea that we can understand Eris and Sedna and all these different things, it takes a while to absorb what these patterns might mean. I didn't want to add anything trivially, but I hope I've already given a hint of how significant Rudyard found these points. I didn't go into this lightly, and I didn't spend 15, 20 years researching it for no reason. I wanted to make sure this was worth introducing, and it would have been a lot simpler to introduce the heliocentric planetary node positions. They don't move very much. This is a map of that very gentle, just over a degree and a half evolution per century of those positions. Whereas geocentric nodes, included here alongside the heliocentric, geocentric nodes have an annual range because of geocentric momentum, which I'll explain in a moment. This is also why my book does not treat the nodes of Mercury, Venus, Mars. They move too quickly, and their annual geocentric range is actually 360 degrees. I picked the nodes of Jupiter outwards, partly because I was dealing with the theme of collective evolution, and also partly because it resolved a technical disparity between geo and heliocentrism, in the sense that the nodes geocentrically of Jupiter outwards don't vary that much from the heliocentric. If we took the example here of the nodes of Pluto, you can see the heliocentric node of Pluto, North Node, was 18 Cancer 58 in 1900. And it's moved about 2 degrees over the last it has 150 year 2 degree potential to grow. And the geocentric nodes of Pluto, if we take the North Node, is 1735 Cancer to 20 Cancer 22. You can see it's not that different, but it moves within the course of a year. It fluctuates. Now, let me try and graphically illustrate this. This is the heliocentric perspective of the nodes of Uranus. See, it's relatively simple. The sun travels around the ecliptic and hits the nodes at a fixed point. Whereas we see geocentrically that the very movement of the sun around the circle of the zodiac, around the ecliptic, creates a waveform motion of fluctuation within the geocentric node. See that curved line that's being formed? That is the geocentric fluctuation. of a planetary node. And it's formed itself. So the heliocentric, if I just come onto it again, I think it will move again. The sun is moving around the ecliptic and the heliocentric node remains the same because the geocentric position is not affecting it. In the case of the geocentric node, it stretches over the course of a year through the sun's journey around the ecliptic. It stretches the momentum of the geocentric perspective of the planetary nodes. Now, what does this mean? And why did I choose to analyze the geocentric? This is a graphic representation of that same form, this time with the node of Pluto. We can see the heliocentric south node of Pluto is a straight line through the middle of the graph. And we can see that the geocentric nodes form that waveform fluctuation based on the path of the sun around the ecliptic. Now, we found in our research that that fluctuating form takes some very interesting historical journeys in the human experience. So let's look at the American War of Independence for a moment. Clearly a momentous, of momentous significance in the history of America. As an Englishman by birth, I could say, you're slightly like an ungrateful child, but I think that would be perceived primarily as a joke, I hope. Now, this birth of a great nation, we see here a series of presentations showing both, this is a Pluto transit to the south node of Saturn that occurred during the American War of Independence. Now we're going to come to this graph from a number of points of view, but we see on the left the timeline, 1770 to 1780. We see the fluctuating waveform of the Pluto transit, and we see the fluctuating waveform of the geocentric variations in the south node of Saturn. And we see that they start to intersect. Let me point this out more clearly. This is the heliocentric south node of Saturn. You can see that the heliocentric south node of Saturn was conjuncted by Pluto, between 1772 and 1775? But the fluctuating nature of the south node of Saturn, its geocentric annual variation, pushes it close to a conjunction to the transiting Pluto, even as far as 1777. If we place here the timeline of the American War of Independence, from the Boston Tea Party, the build-up, the collective tensions in the collective unconscious around extreme taxation that reached the head in the Boston Tea Party, then the event of the war itself, and then the Declaration of Independence, we see that this is the heliocentric conjunction range. So it's significant. There's no criticism of the meaning of the heliocentric nodes in my presentation. Rudyard himself used the heliocentric nodes, and they're much simpler because they don't have this annual fluctuation. But if you add in the second box the geocentric nodes, you realize that what happens here is that the annual fluctuation preserves the contact of the Pluto transit to the south node of Saturn all the way through the process and even to the Declaration of Independence and the first tentative steps of the new nation. The geocentric nodes in their fluctuations sometimes extend an outer planet transit, and this extension seems to follow significant historical timelines. The heliocentric node has moved out of range way before the Declaration of Independence. The geocentric node includes the Declaration of Independence, which is surely the most fundamental outcome of this War of Independence, the fact that it led to the birth of a new nation. We see this phenomena also in the aftermath of the First World War. see that the heliocentric node, when Pluto transits the heliocentric node of Jupiter between 1918 and 1924, you see this period of hope and regeneration after the Second World War and the Spanish flu epidemic. But if you use geocentric planetary nodes, you realize that this whole changing vision of the meaning of culture, transiting Pluto to the north node of Jupiter, and you see that the collective psychic forces of mankind wrestle with the sense of our evolving faith or meaning as civilians of planet Earth. It extends from 1914 to 1933. We find a series of historical events where the geocentric nodes seem to encapsulate a greater range of the historical events and significance represented by the transiting outer planet hitting a significant planetary node. This is the main technical reason that we found working with the geocentric planetary nodes, why they're so significant. The heliocentric nodes have this huge advantage that they are much more fixed. And when you're working with the nodes of Mercury, Venus, and Mars, this is particularly advantageous because in those cases, the planetary nodes of the personal planets, the inner planets, they have a 360-degree annual fluctuation, which is much more complex to study. That study is not included in my book because my book focused on the nodes of Jupiter outwards and the theme of collective evolution, which we're touching on today. So to conclude, geocentric planetary nodes seem to show greater significance for cultural and historical era or epoch defining events on planet Earth and in human culture. Any questions about this part of the presentation? Any burning questions we need to address?
I haven't seen any in chat yet. Is there anybody who'd like to put a question
Well, it's
in
fine.
chat?
It's fine. I'll give regular opportunities. So just mull them
Right.
over and
Nothing
you
so
will
far,
get a chance. Great. Great.
We're amazed. We're amazed. Okay.
So let's start breaking down the specific planetary nodes of the outer planets. And let's start with the planetary nodes of Neptune, and let's start with a few points of conceptual orientation and then go into some personal themic psychological material, and then we'll break down the historical patterns. There's a very interesting phenomena occurring right now, and we'll come to this in later presentation, and some of you may have already noticed from the table I presented earlier that the Saturn-Pluto conjunction of late 2020 and early 2021, that shaped 2020, of early 2020 and throughout, that shaped this year that we're going to look at in greater detail, occurred with Pluto and Saturn on the nodes where Neptune were during the time of Christ. They occurred on their planetary nodes. Maybe this is too complex an idea for right now, but let me introduce it and we'll come back to it in our conclusion. Neptune's nodal range has traveled so significantly that in the 11th century, it shifted or began to shift from Cancer Capricorn to Leo Aquarius. And we'll look at that shift and its meaning in a moment. But we have this interesting phenomena that our current December 2019 conjunction and the shape 2020 of Pluto and Saturn occurred at the point that Neptune's nodes were at during the birth of Christianity. We are literally seeing, if you like, the evolving spiritual ideal of Western civilization, birthed with the nodes of Neptune in Cancer Capricorn at the point where Pluto's nodes are now, in which our current Saturn-Pluto conjunction aligned upon. We are seeing Pluto and Saturn come to explore what Neptune's nodes were doing during the animating spiritual impulse of much of Western civilization. That's the backdrop to the current events that we're building towards. And this graph shows the conjunction at the end of 2019 that shaped 2020 of Pluto and Saturn. And it also shows how those conjunctions intersected on the planetary nodes, the planetary south nodes of Pluto and Saturn. We'll come to that as we look at more contemporary events. But I just wanted to make us aware of this bigger sort of mechanism of history, if you like, that the nodes of Neptune were at a certain position when the animating idea of Christianity revolutionized as this sort of hidden martyr sacrificial cult at the heart of a secret life of a people captured within the Roman Empire, and then eventually through the conversion of Constantine, you know, completely changed that Roman Empire, flowering later on as the Holy Roman Empire, as a central driving force of, you know, European life in the 8th, 9th centuries and beyond. This occurred when Neptune's nodes were Cancer Capricorn, where Pluto and Saturn's nodes are now. The south node of Saturn shifted to that point, shifted as close to that point in the 7th century, and is in that range until 2477. The south node of Saturn coming into that historic Christ point coincides with the development of the Western monastic tradition, coincides with the Islamic conquests and the rise of Islam, which is a kind of Islam recognizes Christ as a teacher and the teachings of the Old Testament and the Jewish faith, but sees Prophet Muhammad as a revelatory successor to those figures. And the south node of Pluto shifted there in 1702 and will be there until the 23rd century. Corresponding with the build-up, the Enlightenment, and the start of the Industrial Revolution. Now, somewhat abstract, but the simple idea here is, are we now facing a plutonic struggle, a collective psychological power struggle about the original spiritual impulse of Western civilization? Neptune, Christianity, certain animating ideas that are central to Western art and culture. And Saturn, the nodes of Saturn there now, are we encountering some sort of limit or even transition phase of that era of Western civilization? I raise it as a question at this point and can come back to it. So to continue this somewhat abstract theme with Neptune and become much more tangible and see the planetary nodes work through history as we go forward, I want to make this other point about the transition from the Neptune's nodes being Cancer Capricorn until roughly the 11th century, and their transition into Leo and Aquarius. Neptune symbolically is a kind of symbol, isn't it, of the collective unconscious or the collective field. And I think this shift to Leo Aquarius and the nodes of Neptune is enormously significant in our era. Remember that the planetary nodes symbolize the evolution of the planetary archetypes themselves. Neptune itself is evolving. And what was a dream of security within civilization, Cancer Capricorn, became, in a transitional period between the 11th and 13th centuries, a shift into a Leo Aquarius signature. And I would argue south node of Neptune Aquarius, and this is related to my work on the mental body and the soul memories contained within the subtly energy fields of individuals and the collective. I would argue that it's the great issue of our time, how we address the collective memories held individually, in families, systemically, in cultures and civilizations, and that you can see this in even current political and social events in a certain naive form, that we're trying to come to terms with the collective memory of trauma within the individual and collective field. And that we could say that psychologically and spiritually, the intended evolutionary direction, the sort of north node of Neptune now in Leo, is the creative actualization of the individual and the collective. that all of our creativity matters, that the piece of the sun in your heart, if you like, is a central spiritual impulse in the current era, that it's shifted from the dream of building a secure civilization as the spiritual impulse, somewhere people could be just, physically safe and build structures to embody that safety. We've gone into a different type of creative crisis. And I would argue to you quite passionately that I think astrology has a part to play in that. That as astrologers, we have been gifted this capacity to look into a kind of portal through the natal chart that can explore the subtle energy fields that people are carrying and the soul memories that they're carrying, and help them understand the individual portion of the collective trauma, the individual and collective trauma that they're carrying, and maybe help them put it down and embrace that Leo little piece of the sun in their heart potential that people have. I would argue that is the creative healing work of turned on astrologers to this issue at this time. But I want to go from this more psychospiritual abstract level to a tangible analysis of history to show you guys just how powerful these planetary nodes are and how often they occur at certain significant turning points in the history of a culture or civilization. And I remember, was it Spengler in The Idea of the Decline in the West? I mean, he thought culture was a genuine animating principle from soul. And he saw that even by the time you're using the word civilization, it's already started to ossify. The initial soulful impetus has already started to calcify into externalized structures that may or may not carry the imprint of that original ensouled meaning. And I think that's also part of what we're facing in our current political and social crises. Now, this was a point that Rudyard, that sort of flipped Rudyard out. Rudyard, not a man renowned for, lack of abstract thinking, or somehow being a wallflower and keeping his opinions to himself. He noticed the fact that the south nodes of Jupiter, Saturn, and Pluto, for all people, effectively, Jupiter, there's some fluctuation, but for centuries now, the south nodes of Saturn and Pluto are in Capricorn and the north nodes are in Cancer, and the nodes of Jupiter, even geocentrically, have predominantly joined them. And Rudyard noticed this kind of gathering at the solstice points that he, as he called it, but he didn't have a sense of what it meant. It flummoxed him, which is a genuinely rare thing if you've read a lot of Rudyard. I mean, he does have thoughts about almost everything. Now, I would say that the collective beliefs, Jupiter, the primary conditioning and external hierarchy structures, Saturn, and deepest psychological impulses and attachments, Pluto, of present-day humanity lie in the history of civilization, Capricorn, and its attempts to structure consciousness through the rise and fall of empires and the dominance of nature as the foundations for the ascendancy of human civilization. The spiritual impulse that we saw in the nodes of Neptune being in Cancer, Capricorn, that it was our impulse to make it a safe world for humans, to reduce the number of wild wolves coming to take children from the alpine huts or whatever. And now we face this crisis. Did we go too far? It was a legitimate attempt to create a safe world for the human animal. And are we encountering limits within that project? But just to establish now, through some historical charts, the power of, say, the nodes of Saturn and Pluto historically. So here we see the foundation of the Habsburg dynasty in 1438, the sun in Capricorn on the south node of Saturn, Pluto on the north node of Saturn. See in the German Peasants' War, the largest insurrection in European history before the French Revolution, we see Pluto on its own south node in 1524. We see in the sack of Rome that created a whole series of domino effects throughout Europe. We see Pluto on the south node of Saturn, soldiers rampaging through the center of Rome, the papacy locked in its innermost sanctum, losing control of the holy city. This act of the sack of Rome gave extra kind of paranoia to the church when it was approached by Henry VIII if he could rid himself of his late brother's wife that he'd married to become king after his brother died young, which triggered the whole excessive reformation and destruction of the abbeys in the UK, where something like 500 abbeys and monasteries were destroyed in 30 years, and all their gold, and the monks imprisoned and their gold and buildings destroyed. In this act of supremacy by Henry VIII, we see these lineups on the nodes of Saturn, Uranus on the node of Saturn. An individual man destroys this legacy of heritage. Saturn in Leo on that north node of Neptune, one individual, the king will be the head of the church as well as the state. Something that's still true to this day in the UK. The Queen is the head of state and the head of the church. It's called the Church of England. This all comes from Henry VIII's action, when the church that was frightened by the sack of Rome would not grant him his personal wishes. You see these points echoed all the time. You actually see, by the way, that Uranus to the node of Saturn is echoing that transition of the node of Saturn. The node of Saturn was at 22 Cancer in the 7th century when the monastic tradition itself was established. And here comes this destroyer of it. And then we come back to the Boston Tea Party, an event we've looked at from a technical vantage point to establish the potential significance of the geocentric nodes to show, the extension of an outer planet transit and its significance in staying allied with the node of Saturn when this vibrant new nation broke away from its rulers that were becoming too narrow and too tyrannical. And the Boston Tea Party has Pluto conjunct the south node of Saturn. It's as if enough's enough. In so many, the book is full. These are small selections from hundreds and hundreds of charts. Even the book is an edited down selection from hundreds and hundreds of charts. The south node, the nodes of Saturn generally, and the nodes of Pluto in Cancer Capricorn, all roughly between about 1822 Cancer Capricorn, are involved in so many imperialistic, formative, country building, significant conflict events. See in the American Civil War, no, sorry, this is still the American War of Independence. As it reaches its most significant battles that lead to the final liberation, Pluto is still transiting that south node of Saturn. In fact, this is the chart form of the graph we looked at earlier. See, transiting Pluto is on the south node of Saturn at the Boston Tea Party. And then in the later significant battles, Pluto has moved on 5 degrees, but so has the south node of Saturn geocentrically because of that annual fluctuation. And we see that it extended the orb of the transiting Pluto to its nodal position as it encompassed the whole impact of the American War of Independence. When Hitler becomes Chancellor of Germany and starts to build the Third Reich, Pluto on the north node of Saturn. It's time and time again. These are just narrow examples. We trace this from Roman civilization to the current day. We have whole sections of files and notes on the Industrial Revolution, on certain discoveries, but the formation of countries. It's transiting Pluto to the nodes of Saturn, transiting Pluto to its own nodes, outer planets to the nodes of Saturn or Pluto. In so many of these examples, when Hitler invaded Poland and triggered England's allegiance to Poland, which triggered the Second World War, Pluto's still close to that node of Saturn. So we see that the nodes of Pluto and Saturn are fundamentally involved in these epoch-defining periods of building empires, of the growth and collapse of civilizations, of countries, of empires. We see it involved, Pluto to the node of Saturn, in this extended orb during the American War of Independence, where it threw off a restricted ruler who was overtaxing, who seemed distant and far away, seemed not to care about the American people. Let's have a look at the 2020 alignment through this lens. Pluto and Saturn conjoined 2246. The south node of Pluto is geocentrically at that point 20 Capricorn 36. The south node of Saturn 23 Capricorn 39. The Pluto-Saturn alignment that shaped this year that we just left behind, this very strange year for the world, troubling year for the world. And this, you know, I lectured on this subject at UAC in 2018. I gave a talk on this in 2017 at NORWAC. You could see that the Pluto-Saturn conjunction of 2020 was on its own nodes years before. This hasn't happened in the 2000 years since the Christ era, in the birth of modernity in any form, the last 2000 years, this has never occurred. Pluto and Saturn conjoined in the 8th century, close-ish to their nodes, about 6 or 8 degrees away from their nodes. That coincided with Charlemagne being crowned the first Holy Roman Emperor. But they have never conjoined in the modern era on their own nodes. We know Pluto's sensitive to its own nodal axis because in its discovery chart, it was conjunct its own north node. This current epoch, this weird time we've been living through, could be seen years in advance to represent some kind of point of limitation or point of struggle or point of power shift or hidden dynamics coming to some kind of crunch time. This is that 783 conjunction here, where Saturn and Pluto came together at 846 Capricorn. You can see the south node of Pluto was at 432, the south node of Saturn was at 14. So they were in 4.5 and 6 degrees. But this modern one is absolutely tight. The conjunction occurred bang on both their nodes. And Mars joined. So, I mean, I have a section here on the breakdown of the 2020 transits and their relationship to the planetary nodes. For time reasons and to make sure I allow time for questions, I won't necessarily go into all of these points in detail. You know, we all lived through this year. We all have a certain sense of it. I've broken it down for you. You'll have access to the slides, the recording. But I mean, these slides will give you a sense of that kind of buildup of a certain feeling within the year itself, from political agitation to, you know, the increasing phenomena of wildfires in Australia and California, the increasing flooding events in other parts of the country, the more extreme weather patterns, the struggles around the Trump presidency, the attempt to impeach, and then we have the declaration of a pandemic. You know, I remember an actual conversation with my researcher about this conjunction where we were looking at, and I'll show you these tables later on about the history of warfare. We were looking at different phenomena that occur under these conjunctions, you know, and just saying, hey, this is happening now, this is happening this month, what's going on? And somewhere a television was over in the corner and there was just some news report, you know, significant virus outbreak reported in China. It's just kind of this minor thing in the corner. We didn't get it. You see the impact on the stock market. You know, we have no real idea even at this point, the financial cost of this last year and parts of this year. So we see these phenomena, and someone posted a very interesting graph showing the Jupiter Pluto conjunctions of 2020 with the spiking in viral figures. That was certainly an interesting correlation, although they've since moved apart and the virus, at least in this country, has not slowed down in any way, shape or form. So we see that this kind of feeling of the agitation of the current era and the accumulated material that's out there is not, you know, this is not a comment about the virus or different policies. I'm not here to make assessments about what degree of lockdown or which country's strategy worked the best. It's not about that. What I'm saying is this deeper feeling in the psyche, virus or no virus, that something is going on with regard to power, authority, the fundamental tenets of Western civilization, the fundamental ideals of Western civilization, this feeling that something's all up for grabs again. People don't seem to fundamentally trust authority or understand some fundamental sense of what's going on or why, seems to correlate to the Pluto-Saturn conjunction on its own nodes. And of course, close to the Pluto return of the United States, where so much of this activity in terms of world news seems to focus. I just wanted to make aware there's been so much talk. I mean, of course, it's kind of humorous from my point of view as a evolutionary astrologer and someone focused very much on Rudyard's work on the outer planets and their significance as a sort of transpersonal layer of meaning. You know, there are some people that just talk about the great Jupiter-Saturn conjunction of 2020. You know, the traditional astrologers still are write, you know, very elegant articles on the prime significance of the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction. To ignore Pluto in the 2020 alignment seems willful to me. It just seems obvious that just like the 1930s when Pluto was discovered was, you know, in the era of the Great Depression and the rise of National Socialism in Central Europe, the current time, the Plutonic edge is clear, I think, to anyone who's open. Let me take a pause on that. I'm going to transfer then to the nodes of Uranus and try and bring these historical ideas together. But let me see if there are any questions.
There is one question so far, or maybe two, about the orbs that you're using to the nodes, the planet, to the planetary nodes.
Great
it
question.
Seems like you've got a 2 or 3 degree orb.
Yeah, exactly. It was 2. For many years, it was 2. And then a series of things extended it to 3. It seems to work. It definitely seems to work at 3 degrees. I mean, you could argue there's influence maybe up to 5 in certain much bigger collective situations, the Second World War, for example. But I'd stay tight to 3. It was originally 2, but then examples Freud's moon on the node of Uranus. He's a clear moon node of Uranus example. Einstein is 2. Einstein becomes the face of science, moon node of Uranus, the mad professor. Freud becomes the face of psychoanalysis, even though much of what he offered as actual psychological theory is of questionable value. But he was, you know, the man with a cigar on the couch. Moon on the node of Uranus. And if you analyze the events of Freud's life, it's that moon node of Uranus conjunction that's triggered at multiple times. So yeah, I extended it to 3 degrees. So I use a 3 degree orb. Great question.
Well, if you're looking at the transits of something like Jupiter or Saturn as they retrograde, they'll retrograde perhaps and go direct over that node several times.
Exactly. And with the geocentric node, remember, in the annual fluctuations, sometimes the annual fluctuations of the geocentric node at certain key dates follows either the forward momentum of the transiting outer planet or its retrogradation back. So geocentric nodes, like that example from the American War of Independence, have this tendency to allow this greater alliance between that transiting outer planet and that fluctuating node. And you see it historically time and time again.
Great. Okay.
So let me transition now to the nodes of Uranus. In fact, you know, I think this theme of reformation that I want to show and of the rise of new technology, the rise of radical new ideas. But let's start by showing a tangible example of this. This is the chart, the natal chart of Martin Luther, the German monk who had a crisis of faith when he visited the Holy City. And, you know, as he attempted to make his measured steps through the hallowed halls of various, you know, critical churches and St. Peter's, he was consistently approached by hawkers and salesmen trying to sell him indulgences and Cardinal such and such had signed this piece of paper, and for 5 gold pieces you would have 50 years less in purgatory when you departed this life, etc. And he was appalled by this and went into a very sincere crisis of consciousness about the spiritual state of the Catholic Church. And of course, his agitation about this, and then his writing, initially the 95 Theses that he wrote and pinned to a church in Wittenberg, became the basis of the Protestant Reformation. And we look at his Mercury-Neptune conjunction on the south node of Uranus. Plenty of monks throughout the history of the church got agitated about specific moral issues. Maybe they raised them with their local bishop. Maybe they posted a series of complaints in their local church. How often did it light the world up like this did, like this monk did? How often did the charismatic voice of one person, because it just happened to coincide with the needs of the German princes to explore their own hegemonic power rather than being dictated to by Rome, he lit the world alight? And you see this time and time again. I have a whole other presentation just of writers, just of people who communicated a message to the world who have Mercury on a planetary node. And it just indicates just this phenomenal correlation between the archetypal power of the planetary node that their Mercury sits on. And in this sense, Luther created unconsciously, effectively, because this man never wanted to break with the church. And that's partly the link of his own personal wounding, that Jupiter south node of the moon to the north node of Chiron. He was personally, in grief about what happened to the Catholic Church. He didn't intend to break it apart. He didn't intend to split Christendom. But his ideas and his communication did do that. Mercury, Neptune to the south node of Uranus. And this is the date of the famous 95 Theses being posted to the church door. The transiting south node of the moon with Saturn on the south node of Jupiter. Pluto close by. The power, the authority, the way it was taken seriously, impacting the south node of Jupiter, the way that people understand their faith or their religious ideals. So when we look at the planetary nodes of Uranus, we often have this theme of reformation or this theme of radical new technology, for good or for ill. These breakthroughs of this scientific, technological, revolutionary material that changes the face of civilization, often in a very sudden, dramatic way. This is Raja from the Astrology of Personality on Uranus. Uranus symbolizes the regenerative force to bring humanity into universal images that supersede prior Saturnian conditioning. Then the nodes of Uranus will tell us the manner in which this regenerative force is operating. This is as early as 1936. Raja is making this kind of profound statement about the planetary nodes and their importance. And Raja saw the predominance, so the north node of Uranus is in Gemini, both heliocentric and geocentric. Raja saw it as crucial to develop the concrete intellect, spatial connections, pragmatic individualized thought, at least in part to overcome the south node Sagittarian tendency towards rigidified systems of belief. And the problem of, if you like, religious ideals that have ossified into formulaic abstractions is their restriction on the intellectual and creative life of humanity. And so Raja's keyed into this in his analysis as early as the Astrology of Personality. I mean, I don't know if anyone needs a break, if you need 5 minutes, because I'm about to go into a presentation of maybe about 10 minutes, which I think encapsulate the power of the planetary nodes, perhaps the most clearly that one could. Do we want a sort of 5-minute restroom break before I do that?
Okay, we do have a couple of questions. Okay. We can,
great.
If you want to take them now, or
of course.
There were questions about the me bring them up again. Whether the planetary nodes progress in retrograde like the lunar nodes or direct motion. Are they like the lunar nodes?
No, that's to do with the orbital motion of the moon around the Earth affecting.
No, I mean
around
that
the ecliptic. They're predominantly forward motion. They are predominantly forward motion. They are not like the lunar nodes. They are different. The lunar nodes are primarily retrograde. They are progressing. Yeah.
How can people find these outer planet node placements for?
So anyone is welcome to email me, and I can send the links to the series of links on my website. There's so much material on the Pluto School about this. So I have 2 separate blog posts on how to use software to find the planetary node positions. I have tables as well, and we have our own created ephemeris that you can also access if you don't have the software. So please just email me at markjones@plutoschool.com, and I don't suppose they're
in your book. If we get your book, do you have any?
Well, the tables are in my book. The ephemeris is not in the book just for spatial reasons, and some of this stuff was created as we were publishing the book, so not all of it is. But the book has the actual tables where you can broadly, from Jupiter outwards, especially from Saturn outwards, there is minimal movement of the geocentric. So the nodes of Pluto are pretty much, for everyone, they're somewhere between 18 and 20 Cancer Capricorn. Saturn 21, 22 Cancer Capricorn, even geocentrically. And those tables are in there. But for your exact positions, software, so Sirius does it, SolarFire does it, and there's a free piece of software called Planet Dance that does it, an absolutely free software developed by a guy in Holland that we've been in touch with during the writing of the book that will give you your planetary node positions. And that's a free piece of software, Planet Dance.
Well, I'm going to plug your book.
Yeah.
Hope you'll do some more
yeah. Well, I mean, the book, these are synthesized core concepts of the book. What the book does is develop this obviously much more sequentially with way more evidence. And then what the book does, it also analyzes an awful lot of natal charts, from Gorbachev and Solzhenitsyn to Alan Turing to writers and key historical figures. It focuses on the impact through natal charts much more, but I chose to show the big picture historical stuff today to generate the compelling evidence, hopefully, to take these positions seriously, because I don't just assume people are going to just pick these up. Why? Astrology is just this potpourri, isn't it, of all these different things you can add on a chart. Sometimes people at conferences show me their chart and they've got so much on their chart, I can't actually see the things I want to see to be able to read or answer the question that they're telling me. I don't want to add to that kind of noise, that white noise in astrology. So I've been very careful about that, but the book does develop these arguments, much more fully, and has a much greater range of natal chart analysis. And it does include some tables, but we're developing material on the Pluto School all the time. I'm trying to see this material as an invitation to us as a community, effectively, to start taking what Rudyard thought was so important. And I've hopefully provided an awful lot of evidence as to why he thought that, and start to incorporate this. What is this hidden dimension? There are points, and I think you'll see what I mean over the next 10 minutes. There are points when I've been studying this, and Jessica Murray referred to this in a lovely sort of validation quote she gave for the cover of the book. It's like it's just opening your eyes to this background hidden dimension of significance in human culture and history. I mean, there's almost no other way to put it. And if you haven't got to that point of mind blown yet in that regard, I think these nodes of Uranus might just do it. So let me just start building to that, and let's take some more questions in 10 minutes, because
let's take that break you wanted to take. Mark.
Okay.
Go ahead.
5 minutes. Well, no, I don't need it. I don't need a break. I'm just checking that no one's switching off. Yeah.
Somebody might want a break. I know one person said great, but of course we can just
let's do it. Let's just do 3 minutes or something. Just anyone who needs the restroom or needs to grab a drink, let's just go for it. I'll just leave this running.
Okay, great. Are we good? Are we ready to go again? Okay.
So let me just try and show you these flashpoints of the nodes of Uranus. So remember what Rudyard said, this regenerative force, it pushes against the Saturn boundaries, it tries to revivify pre-existing structures, or it can bring through even radical technological innovation, or traumatic, I would argue, innovation, or indeed just traumatic. But let's just build historically. So in the regicide of King Charles I, the only time that the British public sanctioned the execution of a king, there are times around the Norman era and just after where individual kings may have been murdered by other parties, but this is the only time, the only revolutionary act where the British Parliament and British people agreed to the execution of a king. You see the Pluto-Saturn conjunction of his execution on the north node of Uranus, and you see the Uranus south node of the moon, Neptune conjunction on the south node of Uranus. That entire Pluto-Saturn north node, Uranus south node, Neptune opposition is on the nodes of Uranus as the only time Britain executed a king. In the US Civil War, the embodiment of brother versus brother, sometimes literally brother firing on brother across the battlefield, Uranus on its own node during the onset of the American Civil War. When the first ever use of tanks came into combat during the Battle of the Somme, the midheaven, this moment is timed, military timed. The midheaven of the moment is the node of Uranus. We're going to see this theme, this particular theme of the midheaven of the moment echoed in a moment or two by one of the most significant examples, I think, in this presentation. The creation of the final solution. Jupiter on the node of Uranus, Mercury on the node of Pluto, in the meeting, in the conference that led to the sign-off on the final solution. Jupiter is on the node of Uranus, Mercury on the node of Pluto. The dark place the mind can go, Mercury to node of Pluto. The vision of meaning that can be so destructive or traumatic, Jupiter to the node of Uranus. But this is a critical example for me. The Hiroshima event, timed to the minute by the US military, the first use of an atomic bomb in civilian warfare in the world. Transiting Uranus is on the midheaven of that moment, and transiting Uranus and the midheaven of that moment are on the north node of Uranus. Uranus is on its own north node, and it's on the midheaven, and the midheaven of the moment that the first ever atomic bomb, that the fruits of the Manhattan Project were visited upon the world. Midheaven of the moment on the north node of Uranus. We see also in this chart the Saturn-Moon conjunction is on the node of Pluto. This event triggers the succession of events that lead to the end of the Japanese Empire and the tradition of the emperor as the complete head of the military. We also see, and this corresponds also to the discovery in 1945 of the camps and the early footage from British, American and Russian soldiers at the death camps, transiting Pluto to the north node of Neptune. We discover that in his complex psychological underbelly, mankind, humankind, is capable of destroying the spiritual ideal of other people having that piece of sun in that heart or being a child of God, that a culture could turn on others and consciously enact genocide. That we are encountering here with the Pluto conjunction in 1945 to the north node of Neptune, the destructive aspect, Pluto, of man or humankind's creative and spiritual impulse, node of Neptune. Now, remember this midheaven of the moment, conjunct Uranus, conjunct the node of Uranus, when you see the first atomic bomb, that shocks the world. When you see the second in the Nagasaki event, you see, look, the midheaven of the moment, 25 Cancer 38, is on the north node of Saturn. In the first event, it's a Uranian shock. The first use of this technology rips through the world. In the second event, days later, you see a Saturnine planetary node on the midheaven. This is the event that leads finally to the vote in the Japanese high military upper echelons, the generals and the emperor. And the generals are, I think, I've heard that it's 2-2 between the generals on whether to end the war and surrender. And it's the emperor that cast the deciding vote and chose to surrender. It's the Nagasaki event that led to the consequential phenomena of the end of an empire and the end of the Second World War. VJ Day went from a shock of new technology, midheaven to node of Uranus, to midheaven to node of Saturn, the real world structural, political, social consequences. When you look at the 9/11 event, and during the aftermath here, there was so much astrological writing on the Pluto-Saturn opposition, obviously, because it was very significant, but no one was talking about the fact that that Pluto-Saturn opposition was across the nodes of Uranus. Radical new technology, the use of civilian aircraft as a weapon, the threat from flight, Pluto-Sagittarius, literally impacting Saturn and Gemini, the two towers, but it's on the nodes of Uranus. This shocked the world, this shaped the world, this shaped travel for millions and millions of people for decades to come. It's the nodes of Uranus that show the kind of shock and awe that came through the revolutionary use of technology in this troubled way, and relative to what? Ideological religious jihad, south node of Uranus. The identification that the Twin Towers was somehow, you know, Mammon's tool for money making, and the religious puritanical judgment of capitalism or the mercantile role of these buildings, a symbol of terror from a jihadi stance. It's all embedded in the nodes of Uranus. And these events that are so significant in the modern world and the shaping of the modern world, you know, the atomic bomb at the end of the Second World War led to the Cold War effectively, alongside various other problems, you know, the problematic alliance with Stalin in order to remove Hitler, that then became effectively giving Stalin other parts of Europe and creating the Iron Curtain. These events that shape the modern world, seeing the planetary nodes on the key points. And astrologers have looked at those key points many, many times, but there's been very little written about, you know, during the mainstream astrological response to the Pluto-Saturn opposition here, there was very little writing about the planetary nodes. And yet the first thing I saw looking at, it's just intriguing to me that a figure as important as Rudyard, having realized the crucial importance of these positions, that it's not been picked up on. It's not to say there haven't been people that picked up yet. Grant Louis, Carl Payne Toby, Jeff Green, Rudyard, Zip Dobbins, people in Central Europe around the Uranian or Cosmobiological School. But it's not entered mainstream astrological analysis. And yet, I would argue these examples are compelling as to how it might, as to how it might interest us. There appears to be a way that their presence in the natal charts of certain individuals and in very significant collective event charts seems to indicate an archetypal domain of meaning that floods into the human experience. In the case of the nodes of Uranus, often through shocking events. And let me just continue this sort of larger historical analysis for a moment and try and summarize something for you that we found somewhat revelatory and also genuinely shocking in our research. We noticed that there was a pattern in the start of major conflicts. So we've analyzed some of the most significant conflicts since the 14th century to the present day. And what you often see is an outer planet in a prominent fourth harmonic aspect to the node of Saturn when very significant conflicts begin. And then as we followed this analysis, we then began to notice that those same wars often ended when an outer planet had a prominent fourth harmonic relationship to the node of Neptune. I shared this in a very crowded room in UAC 2018 in Chicago. There had been some sort of mismanagement by the hotel right at the heart of the Miracle Mile, where even though they tried to open up double rooms, lots of speakers were having potential attendees turned away from their door. And in my case, they did that at some point, but they hadn't fully grasped the situation. And at one point giving this talk, I had the entire seats full, but I also had about 30 people gathered around me sitting cross-legged, so that my movement was restricted, this very small parameter. And if you see me in person, I often pace around when I present. Some people using my laptop screen to see these slides. And there was a collective gasp when I presented this material on the start of major wars and the end of major wars. And we can see also when we were looking at that Saturn-Pluto conjunction that shaped 2020, it's Saturn-Pluto on the node of Saturn. It's a major war trigger type signature. Now, we didn't have a major war, but certainly some parts of the world don't feel like they're completely in peacetime right now. And then we see this phenomena at the end of wars. The south node of Saturn being triggered to start structural conflicts of a mass scale, and the node of Neptune being triggered as those conflicts resolve or some kind of peace is restored. I personally feel patterns like this deserve exploration. They point to a way of looking, and I used James McPhail's Astrology and the Causes of War in my analysis of the Gulf conflict in the book and the use of the planetary nodes. You know, an excellent book, but nothing astrologically has looked at this kind of patterning on a larger meta scale, taking a step back and seeing the nodes of planets have these kinds of contacts when you're looking at the events that shaped world history to this extent. Here are some of the individual examples. The peace treaty signed in 1918 at the end of the First World War, transiting Saturn on the node of Neptune, transiting Neptune very close to its own node. Battle of Waterloo, bringing to the effective end Napoleon's dominance of Europe, transiting Saturn exactly on the south node of Neptune as a huge and famous naval battle, brings to end Napoleon's dynastic conquests. So, I mean, you know, my relatively humble intention today, for those of you who've followed this far, is that this is supposed to be, in a way, overwhelming evidence as to the worthiness of investigating these points in collective event charts and individual charts. Even the nodes of Chiron, and I'll just mention them briefly, show up time and time again in collective famine events. The nodes of Chiron seem to be involved in events of mass suffering. I think the ascendant of the birth of Israel is on the node of Chiron, which gives you a certain feel, you know, this nation of this attempt to heal a traumatized people being created in a land surrounded by people naturally antipathetic towards them, you know, non-supportive neighbors. So we've tried through this historical analysis to provide compelling evidence to support what was existing for Rudyard on an effectively philosophical, intuitive level, that he'd had these intense intuitions as to their power and significance. My researcher and I, over the last 3 or 4 years, we've attempted to flesh this out. We have box files. We have these huge scrapbooks. We just cut out charts and linking notes throughout the history of the last 2,000 years. We're in contact with the founders of the Swiss ephemeris to work out planetary nodes prior, you know, BC timescale. But it's very, very difficult to do, especially, say, with the nodes of Pluto, because it's actually very hard to calculate Pluto's exact position going back thousands of years, which is quite surprising, but does present some enormous challenges to trying to make this research extend back further in time. So I've got a section on the implication of this material for the lunar nodes, but maybe I can take some questions first, because this is my main presentation really in terms of an appeal to you as creative and thinking astrologers, that these nodal placements are worthy of significant attention and study.
Yes, we do have some
yes.
questions. Let me see if I can get back up here to the oh, let's see.
Well, maybe I can also ask the general question of people.
Yes.
I mean, have I succeeded, at least in some sense, of conveying that? I mean, does this seem interesting in that regard? Because what I have done in choosing this kind of material is I have steered away from individual natal charts. I know we're all very interested in individual natal charts, and this material does have some very interesting implications in natal charts, but that hasn't been as fully explored, because it's much harder to trace collective significance in an individual natal chart, especially when I'm doing readings for people. Yeah.
There was, okay, so I'm trying to take them in the order they came in. There's one from Seo. Do you relate? I forget exactly where you were, but it was about 10 minutes ago. The material, do you relate this to the insurrection in DC 2 days ago?
I haven't looked at contemporary astrology in the last few days.
Okay.
So, I mean, but I put it to you, yeah, look for those connections. I'm sure if there are planetary nodal contexts, they'll be very interesting.
Have you looked at the outer planetary nodes, how they could affect an individual? I'm thinking of the murder of John Lennon.
I don't know in the case of Mark Chapman and John Lennon. I have looked at, the book includes many. So the book includes an extended section on the history of psychology through individual charts, people who shaped the rise of psychology, the birth and rise of psychology in the 20th century. It has a section on the history of science, where it looks at prominent scientists and their discoveries through their natal charts, and correspondence between natal chart planets and planetary nodes to show the collective significance, kind of pushing into that individual scientist's work from Pasteur to Fleming. So that's very interesting. I've looked at a lot of different natal charts. I haven't particularly looked at that moment of Chapman and Lennon, although that was a significant moment in my childhood. You know, I just got to the age where I could realize how big a loss it would be that a Beatle just died. Yeah. I mean, it's worth, I'm inviting you in a way to go and look at those things, you know, how, yeah.
Is there any nodal effect on the day of the US inauguration? You say you haven't really looked at the contemporary.
I work with a lot of individuals, you know, around the world, especially since lockdown. Like, I've done a phenomenal amount of dialogue with people around the world, but especially in the US. And I'm aware how complex the position is. I'm a non-expert. I'm a non-US resident. I can't vote. I'm not an expert on US politics. I have not made it a major part of my contemporary study. No, I've looked predominantly at the historical picture.
Somebody's wondering if you can sign the copy of the book that she orders.
I hope so. I hope we meet and I can do that. That would be lovely. Thank you.
So they'd email you directly and
Well, I mean, if they want an actual personal signature, hopefully we're back in a world where we're at some conference together or something. But yeah, we could, if it can be done electronically, I'm open.
Okay, I don't see any others right this moment. I think what I'm seeing is everybody's really impressed. They're loving it. They're loving this presentation. Really
Well, I'm
opening up
really
some
glad, and I'm
eyes.
really glad. And these questions, these great questions about contemporary events, which are clearly, well, I am implying that the great Saturn-Pluto conjunction of 2020 is, and its implications, the way it revisits the historic point of the nodes of Neptune during the time of Christ, the way that they haven't been together on their own nodes in the last 2000 years, and yet suddenly here they are. I do think that helps provide an understanding of this background sense that many of us have, that we live in interesting times, that bigger patterns are playing out in contemporary events. So I do think it supports that. But these fascinating examples, Chapman and Lenin, the contemporary events, I'm urging us all to look at them, that we get impact. There's free software out to check the positions, to look at, natal chart, context to planetary nodes of the individuals involved. And there's lots of material in the book about natal charts. And then to start investigating these things. I think maybe is that what happened? Did so many people, because Rudyard's so esteemed, but did people get tired of his intuitional philosophical flights of fancy at points, or the books that got filled with quasi-theosophical stuff? Because I wonder why, when Rudyard is so esteemed, why so many of his actual pointed insights were not picked up by a generation after him. And I hope genuinely here, as an act of service to what he did contemplate, that this restores some of that balance, that we start investigating these things now. And if you have particular things you come across, please feel free to email me, or I'll put you in touch with my researcher. We are still actively working on this material. We will be gathering data about this, data that from responses that the book itself produces. And I'm also hoping my researcher, who's now extremely gifted in this field, does some writing of his own. He's already begun to do some material on the chart of nations. But I'm hoping we can pick up some stuff on the personal planetary nodes at some point, although the complexity geocentrically of their 360-degree annual variation is complex, but that itself holds patterns in it. There'll be certain days a year where the node of Venus geocentrically is on the node of Uranus, and that will be roughly similar every year. These are kinds of patterns that there's all sorts of stuff that our research hasn't gone into, because it can take a phenomenal amount of time to do this type of research accurately for people, in my case, that are speaking to 20 plus individuals, doing 20 plus consultations a week, almost every week, and doing other teaching. And then, my researcher working separately, and then we come together and analyze it. So it'd be great if there was more of a group mind around it.
I'm sure that people can purchase your book from your website, right?
From the website, from Amazon, from the website. Yeah, both of those things.
I have a question. I was just thinking that these planets in Aquarius, well, Jupiter's supposed to get up to Pisces, with the nodes of Neptune are currently in Pisces, right?
No, the nodes of Neptune are South Node Aquarius and
Aquarius.
Jupiter.
I'm sorry. Yes, Aquarius.
Jupiter, transiting Jupiter, will be on the South Node of Neptune by the end of this month, and transiting Saturn will follow by about March. So, in a world of, whatever you want to call it, the vaccine rollout, or some sort of hope that the immediate impact of this crisis event around the pandemic might alter, they do seem indicative of some kind of possibility of that. But the larger transition, that of Pluto into Aquarius, Pluto doesn't hit the South Node of Neptune until very late in the 2020s, or even 2030. But it gets close. It gets within the 3-degree orb by about 2026. Is that relevant in the equinox precession? Is that part of the transition to the age of Aquarius? larger questions. But, you know, clearly Pluto going to the south node of Neptune is very significant. But yes, transiting Saturn will be there late March, April. And Saturn to the node of Neptune has been involved in signatures we found in the creation of peace after significant global conflict. The transition of Pluto to that point would be even more significant in terms of its slower moving orb. But Jupiter is maybe a vision of a star. Yeah, I think that's a very significant line of inquiry. In fact, in another presentation, and makes me wish that the slides were just here right now, I traced those future signatures to show that end of war offset thing. If COVID-19 is the current war, the invisible enemy, then yeah, those signatures suggest the change around that point. And it's very, very soon. And in fact, it's really fascinating, isn't it? After what seemed like an age of Jupiter at the end of Capricorn, it races through Aquarius. I mean, it's early Pisces by the summer. I mean, it goes back, but I mean, it's phenomenally interesting, these points of rapid forward motion, and not in even regular natal planetary or, planetary progression, non-planetary node progression. So yeah, Jupiter there by the 26th of January. It's on the south node of Neptune, or close by early February. Yeah.
Something to keep in mind for sure. We've had, of course, in this century, this last 20 years, of course, we've had Uranus transit those nodes as is going through Aquarius. We had Neptune transit its own nodes. Did you have any significant data?
There is some, yeah, exactly. I mean, well, I think that's where really the book historically deals with the rise of the Roman civilization, fall of the Roman civilization up to the end of the Second World War, apart from 9/11, I think is mentioned. I think this more current last few decades build up to the contemporary scene is where either me or my researcher needs to go next. I'm hoping my researcher, but it might actually be me. So I think that's a good reminder. Yes, I traced those things at the time. I don't have a coherent set of principles. We haven't written that up, but I think that's going to be part of one of our next steps. Because of course we have lived through those things. And of course, Pluto in Sag on the nodes of Uranus was about much more than 9/11. You saw increased migration, an issue that hasn't gone away, all sorts of phenomena. So yeah, our research is not complete by a long way.
It seems in this time of endless war, the push for a greater spiritual consciousness must be the objective, or the what's happening in spite of it.
I mean, I think that, yeah, clearly we've, the Game of Thrones series and books, not that I've engaged with them very profoundly, but they're a bit too close to home, aren't they? I mean, and I think he developed that idea on a trip to Britain when he was contemplating Hadrian's Wall and, the Roman army and the invasion of the barbarians from the north and the Great Wall. This kind of Game of Thrones has been going on through society, up until really, well, now, but it changed a lot in the West with the Second World War. I mean, I think we're looking, is there a possibility of a different time? Can the world come out of the Game of Thrones struggle? I mean, war does provide spiritual opportunity as well, times of great crisis, to show courage, to show integrity, to stand up for what you believe in, or young men even finding themselves traveling across the world, or finding their courage or not in these extreme conflicts. But clearly, yeah, it would be fantastic, wouldn't it, if humans could learn without that level of conflict. But I don't think we're close to that change just yet. And clearly, I think there are spiritual potentials. When we talk about transpersonal and collective evolution, there is that transpersonal idea. I've looked primarily at historical collective evolution, but there is a spiritual message. And I guess that's why I touched on what must have seemed like a slightly abstract point at the time, that position of the nodes of Neptune at the time of Christ, around 1820 Cancer Capricorn, which are the nodes of Pluto and Saturn now. But I do think that's terribly significant, Peter Kingsley, the classic scholar, who's written a lot on the pre-Socratic philosophers being kind of ecstatic spiritual visionaries rather than these fathers of logic and rhetoric. The birth of Western civilization had this spiritual impulse to it. He wrote a book on Jung called Catafalque, in which he rediscovers the visions and dreams that Jung was having towards the end of his life of the collapse of Western civilization, that his personal secretary, Amelia Jaffe, removed from Memories, Dreams and Reflections. And it does seem that we've entered a kind of the fundamental inner impulse of Western civilization is going through some, breakdown to break through, crisis that leads to a higher order of meaning, or just crisis. I don't know, but we certainly seem to be entering a phase where the implicit animating ideals of Western civilization that would have been obvious to people maybe only 50, 60 years ago on some kind of inner level would have had an energetic spark to them, perhaps no longer do for that many people. And then you see the resulting mental health crisis that becomes the offset of that as we have this time in fortunate parts of the world of great affluence and relative security, even in a pandemic, in terms of just like hospital care, television, a smartphone, a car, mobility, some kind of place to lay your head, which large parts of the world haven't always had. You see this absolute psychic crisis, phenomenal prescription drug problems, opioid problems, suicide rates that are off the charts in some age groups, just crazy levels of cutting. My friend and colleague was a therapist in a university for a long time. The number of intelligent young women, charming people, just cutting themselves or lacerating, self-harm. It's just a shocking thing when you look into it, that these are unconscious expressions of that loss of an animating ideal. People are going into a sort of deeper crisis of meaning. And as Viktor Frankl's work showed after the concentration camps in Man's Search for Meaning, a sense of meaning is fundamental to survival. It's not just an abstract. You begin to lose the volitional animating power of the human psyche to maintain your immune system, to maintain your belief and energy for life, if the animating psychological and spiritual ideals of your time, of your culture, begin to fade.
And so having these planets conjunct the nodes of Neptune can mean more than just the end of a war. I mean, you've suggested, look at this is interesting, the end of the wars.
Yes, of course. Well, and this is my point.
Neptune, since you're addressing this fact that Neptune is about dissolution, I mean, just the dissolving things.
But it's also about that point I was making about astrology, this Jupiter-Saturn conjunction in Aquarius. Astrology seems to be on the rise again in the world, and that often coincides with that, blessing, curse, may you live in interesting times. People seek some sort of greater divinatory sense of meaning. Now, how do we handle that? Does that descend into superstition, the projections of people's radical existential anxiety into some construct of what the stars are going to tell them, how they're going to be saved, or their fear of the signatures? Or is there a potential for more psychologically and spiritually grounded students and followers and disciples of a kind of bright vision of astrology to utilize astrology to help people rediscover an individual path to that meaning in a time when the collective symbols can't just easily offer it to them? And do we owe it to ourselves as astrologers to learn more than astrology, to maintain psychological and spiritual growth in ourselves? Because in a crisis time in the world, more and more people are called to be elders, more and more people are called to support people, and suddenly you don't have to be that old to be an elder when everyone else is losing track. More and more people are called, and astrology helps people grow. If you can hold astrology right and not turn it into an externalization, like a projection of some external validation from on high, but learn to live with it and learn to use it as a portal to your own psychological and spiritual growth, can we then use that path to serve others? More and more people are turning to astrologers. Can we be grounded and tangible in what we offer?
And also, as someone put, as Barbara has put in the chat, the astrologer's ability to maybe infuse wonder, to bring about a sense of wonder and awe and amazement at the patterning of our of our planetary, our solar system. I mean, when we think of the patterning,
Yes,
that was always amazed and filled me with awe as I studied astrology. If we can just even bring that back
exactly. I know.
that to people.
I couldn't agree more. And that's only one reflection of it. But yeah, I remember the joy on a lawyer who was broadly speaking Christian, very high level lawyer, who I just showed his chart to, and I showed the gathering in it. And then we would, you know, the events of his life that we've been talking about, the struggle with his mother, the way it impacted into his life, everything in the fourth house with the Jupiter square to the Pluto South Node conjunction in the fourth in Leo. And his just, you know, we'd spent 3 months of therapy, him beating himself up about his life decisions. And just to see that the pattern was, you know, that it was meaningful, just the structural shape of his chart corresponded with his experience of his own life was a liberation for him. I couldn't agree more. I would argue this, right? In an era of materialism predominantly, which doesn't even seem, and excessive technological optimism as a compensation for the loss of psychological and spiritual ideals, we are gifted this opportunity. People are desperate, and we could go beyond, how can we say this, a version of astrology where we're scared all the time of the next Saturn transit, the next Pluto transit. You know, we could be brave here and say, in an era of scientific materialism, astrology's had a very lowly status, which has often affected the growth of the profession. You know, people have dedicated their whole life, very clever people have dedicated their whole life to a subject that people don't take seriously, that people laugh at them, snigger at dinner parties, or turn and talk to the eminent professor in the room instead. I mean, this insecurity has dogged the profession in some ways. Or I think of the experiences Richard Tarnas had to suffer after being a universally acclaimed academic for The Passion of the Western Mind, and then vilified by former followers when he wrote Cosmos and Psyche. And yet he's a forebearer of Cosmos and Psyche, has added great intellectual gravitas to our profession, but the costs to him in his academic reputation. We've lived in this era where astrology has been seen as a kind of a joke. And yet in a culture that's lost its way and has become predominantly materialist in a certain way, has the joke profession actually got this profound, these hidden gifts, this treasure to offer people? I feel that way. Certainly a lot of the people I'm speaking to feel that way. I think it's tremendously inspiring time to be a student of astrology.
Amen. Amen, brother.
Yeah.
That gives us, let's all take heart. And
I feel that way. I genuinely feel that way. I'm working with people all the time on different levels around everything from people who lost everything at the beginning of this to people who haven't been affected, but have just used the quietness that descended on the world to go deeper into their own psychological process. And I have experienced that. A lot of people, I think, that were naturally introverted or carrying the sense of burden in this kind of world shutdown time have actually used it to go deeper. But the astrology is so helpful. It's like a kind of, what did someone say with great delight with me once talking to me? Oh, it's like therapy with a map, you know? It's like a deep psychological growth journey, but we're actually being guided by something, not this just terrible sense that therapy could go on forever and I might never get anywhere. Yeah, from the patterns of people's charts, I would say all the way to this. If we're, most of us here, maybe not all of us, certainly I myself was drawn to astrology because of my psychological and spiritual growth interests. And I find, visioned in a certain way, it can be tremendously supportive of a psychological and spiritual vision of meaning. I mean, why does a birth chart even work at all if this isn't a meaningful universe? Why would even the moment you were born, why would it even symbolically express anything at all if the whole of life wasn't inherently stabilized with a meaningful sense? How would anything as mundane as yet another person born in yet another space-time moment even contain that symbolism if cosmos itself wasn't meaningful to Psyche? If Psyche itself wasn't born of cosmos, if Psyche itself didn't arise from the cosmic background, infinite field with its own unique potential, like a flower. How could it even be so? How could a birth chart even carry meaning without that potential?
Beautifully said. Has anybody got another question? We're going to have to let Mark go real soon now. It's pretty late over there where he is. Anybody got a question? I'll put it in the chat, or even unmute yourself and ask the question.
It's lovely to see some faces here. Some I know, some I don't know. It's been really nice to do a presentation where I actually see people. God bless you all, frankly. Good luck. Good luck going forward. May we, when we take our own blessings into this world, yeah, and not be afraid. Have the courage and integrity to shine our light.
Thank you so much. Put your hands together, everybody, so Mark can see how much you enjoyed this.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Take care.
Have a good night.
All the best.
Everybody else, you can stay on if you want to. We'll let Mark go. We can stay on and chat a bit. Good night, Mark. Thank you so much.